Hello and welcome to Crisis What Crisis, a new podcast designed to be a useful field guide as we all try to navigate and come to terms with a dramatically changed world. Whether it's personal, professional, or both, crisis is without doubt the new shared experience. I'm Andy Coulson, a former newspaper editor, Downing Street Director of Communications and one-time inmate of HMP Belmarsh. For the last 4 years, I've been putting all my experience, the good and the bad, to use as a strategic advisor to business leaders. And I can tell you that the bad has been just as useful as the good. And that got me thinking that there are plenty of great podcasts out there where you can hear stories of success. There are far fewer where you can benefit from the experience of those whose lives have properly unraveled. So in Crisis What Crisis, I'll be talking to the embattled, shamed, courageous, ruined, damaged, resilient, unlucky and lucky survivors of crisis. Some names will be familiar, some less so, but all our guests will talk about their crises honestly, often with humour, but always in the hope that what they have to share might be useful to anyone facing down their own demons and challenges. Put simply, these are crisis stories worth sharing. If you agree and enjoy what you hear, please do give us a rating and review. That way, even more people will hear them, and that, in the end, is what it's all about. Crisis What Crisis is generously supported by Mindstream, a brilliant company who harness the power of music for personal well-being, whether it be music for meditation, to help focus, sleep, stress relief, yoga and fitness, rejuvenation, even grief and loss. Mindstream is there to improve human performance. I've tried it, it works, and I'd recommend having a listen to the Mindstream catalogue yourself. Just search Mindstream, that's mind with a Y, on Spotify. Thanks again for joining me. My guest today is the fashion stylist and activist, Payzee Mahmod. Payzee's story is one of the most difficult we've explored, frankly, are ever likely to explore on this podcast. Parts of this crisis story you might have seen dramatised very recently in ITV's Honour, a programme that Payzee is keen I make clear she didn't contribute to. Instead, she prefers to tell her story herself, and it's a privilege to have her here today to do just that. Born in Iraqi Kurdistan, Payzee is one of 6 children. In 1999, when she was 11, and after some time living in Iran, her mother and father came to live in South London. The family settled into life in Mitcham as part of the Kurdish community, a strict, often oppressive patriarchal community with a clear code of behaviour, particularly in relation, of course, to young women. Payzee's eldest sister, Bekel, rebelled against that regime, and as a teenager, she left the family home and was eventually put into foster care. As a result, Payzee's father, Mahmod, was ostracised. He had, in the eyes of his community, dishonoured them. As a result, her father's control over Payzee and her other sisters became even more restrictive. To gain back that respect, at just 17, he forced her sister Banaz to marry an older man. A year later, Payzee walked into her sitting room to be told that the stranger sat in front of her, a man twice her age, was to be her husband. Banaz was soon the victim of abuse at the hands of her partner, abuse she reported, but that was ignored by her parents and the authorities. Sometime later, and having left her husband, she began a relationship with another man, Ramat Salumani. Payzee, during this time, was living her own forced marriage nightmare. Banaz and Ramat endured a number of death threats, which again were reported to the police. In January 2006, he reported Banaz as missing. 3 months later, her body was found in a suitcase, buried in a garden in Birmingham. Payzee, then 18, arranged her 20-year-old sister's funeral, the community offering no support or help as she did so. But in that same month, she was able to divorce herself. As she puts it, her sister's death enabled her freedom. The following year, Payzee and Banaz's father and uncle were convicted, along with a number of other male relatives, of murder, guilty of her so-called honour killing. Banaz had been raped, tortured and strangled. A decade later, Ramat very sadly took his own life, unable to cope with the horror of what had happened to Banaz. As I say, Payzee was able to escape her forced marriage and begin the rebuild of her young life. Her childhood so damaged, she's focused with quite remarkable resilience on 2 things. First, a career in fashion, the profession she loves, and more recently as an activist, a campaigner against forced marriage, child marriage and FGM, something she and her sisters were also forced to undergo as young girls. Payzee is an ambassador for the IKWRO, women's rights organization. She's turned her sister's murder and the unimaginable tragedy of both their young lives into a truly powerful purpose. Payzee, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Crisis What Crisis. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to talk with you today.
Before we start, your petition to end child marriage in this country, to make child marriage illegal, has reached more than 150,000 signatures. You must be delighted with that progress.
I am. To be honest, I never ever thought it would gain this amount of incredible public support. We're almost at 200,000 signatures. And it's great to see that there's so much support. Yeah. I think for a long time, I always felt that what happened with me and my sister and these marriages taking place may be quite rare. But the more this conversation happens online, the more people reach out to me on social media and talk about their own experiences. And the more people are keen to lend their support and, agree that this is horrendous and has to stop, especially in a country that we say we're leaders.
Let's chat briefly about the law, which of course is at the heart of your campaign. It is in Scotland, before we talk about England, but in Scotland, you can marry from 16 without parental consent, correct?
Yes, exactly.
In this country, you need parental consent at the ages of 16 and 17. But of course, and as we're going to discuss, as we talk about your story, that in some ways, and I think you would argue, facilitates kind of coercion. Is that how you see it?
Yes, absolutely. So I think the first thing to remember is that in our current law, children can't make that decision for themselves anyway. So in a sense, we're saying that by having these laws, 17 and 16-year-olds can't make that decision. They're not able to have informed decisions. And so somebody else, an adult, has to step in and allow them to, make that decision. So what we're saying is if children can't make that decision, we know they shouldn't be. So let's cut off that loophole completely and not allow anybody to be able to use this as a means to abuse.
And your point is that the percentage of marriages that are actually that actually involve 16 and 17-year-olds is so small, well under 1%, that this is an issue that should be relatively easy to fix.
Exactly.
That's part of the argument.
Yes, exactly. Although, as you said, the numbers are low when we're talking about registered marriages, we also have to take into account that in the UK, if you do marry under any sort of religious or cultural marriage,
yes, it
does not have to be registered. So we have to remember that, yes, we have these marriages on record, but how many girls are being married in cultural religious marriages or marriages that happen abroad that the government cannot see a picture of?
Yes.
So that's really important if we're talking about completely illegalizing child marriage under 18. That covers everybody. That covers people who are doing religious marriages or cultural marriages. Therefore, there's a clear-cut message for everybody.
Of course. Your situation, though, your marriage was registered. Am I right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Well, look, again, congratulations on the campaign.
Thank you.
And I hope that this conversation will add a few more signatures.
I hope so too, especially ahead of our second reading. So the bill which was presented on October the 6th by Pauline Latham MP has now got a date for a second reading. So it'd be incredible to just keep the support up for that reading and hopefully we'll get it to the next stage.
Very good. Payzee, how early in your life were you, did you sort of become aware of this concept of honour that sits at the centre of your story?
To be honest with you, it might sound crazy, but I remember being a little girl around the age of 5, maybe 6, and being told how to behave. And it really stayed with me because the way that me and the other girls around me were told how to behave was so different to how boys were allowed to behave. So I had male cousins and I lived in a massive household with my uncles and aunts and their children. And of course I have an older brother. But there was always this distinction of you are a girl so you must behave in this way,
Mm.
because essentially the way you behave paints a picture of your family's reputation and how well you've been raised, as though it didn't matter for boys and it didn't matter how boys behave, because their behavior doesn't add anything to the family's reputation. So I became aware of that from a really, really young age.
Was that idea even more pronounced in the conversations that you would have with your family once you'd arrived in the UK?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. There was things, obviously, growing up where I spent the first 11 years of my life. I grew up in Iran, where we didn't go to school because we were Iraqi immigrants. We never really left the house. We didn't integrate with anybody outside of our home. But coming here, we started going to school. We started, having friends, watching TV, and being exposed to, I guess, this whole new world. And I think for my parents, there was a massive threat in that, and they really kind of they upped the levels in terms of what we could and we couldn't do. So my parents didn't like us listening to music that wasn't Kurdish, for example. They didn't like us to watch soaps because soaps would explore the idea of relationships and drinking or smoking or dressing too Western, they would put it. So they really did become more and more strict when we lived here. Yeah.
Your older sister, Beckel, was the first to sort of display the sort of spirit of independence. What do you remember about that? She was the first, in the family. How did that kind of what effect did that have on life at home?
To be honest, as soon as she sort of started displaying those, I guess what at the time for us was kind of out of the norm behavior. So she would have friends and she would wear makeup and, she would work or she would socialize. And for us, we were so shocked by it, me and my sisters, because we were so worried about the repercussions if any of us were to behave like that. And I think watching how brave she was and how she stood up to my dad, she didn't care that it would get her in trouble. She just wanted to be a normal teenager.
Let's just very quickly explain the age differences between the sisters. So Beckel at this stage is what age?
So she would have been about, I think, 16 now. She was just leaving school and going to college and starting to sort of, become, I guess, a bit more independent and learning about other things like maybe working part-time and having friends and not wearing school uniform and expressing herself through fashion and makeup and, music and all those things. And I just remember thinking, wow, she's so brave, because I would be way too scared to,
So how old were you at this stage?
So now I would have been about 13. Yeah, about 30, going on 13. Yeah.
But you were having your own sort of few acts of small rebellion, weren't you? I mean, if one were to walk into, your bedroom at that age, I've heard you talk about it. Britney Spears posters on the wall. Your love of fashion was already beginning to show itself.
It was, yeah.
How were you finding that balance at home?
You know what? I was really trying to take little steps into, discovering new things. But I found my sister, for example, she was very open about what she wanted to do. And, she would display her I guess, her desires for the things that she was interested in. But I remember I would put posters in my bedroom, but they would go in the inside of my wardrobe, so that I could only see them if I was opening the door to get dressed, and my parents wouldn't see them. So, and I was just collecting them. Your dad
wouldn't see them.
No, yeah, exactly. And he would always say, why do you have posters with people wearing clothes like this, crop tops and, girls and boys, provocatively standing next to each other and that kind of thing. He was really worried. I think that was one of his biggest worries, is that we would learn about relationships and, the idea of sex and, this forbidden thing that no girl should ever know about until she's married.
When you look back at that period of your life, are you able to? Is it all because of the sort of tragedy that followed, and the events that you lived yourself?
Mm-hmm.
Are you able to look back on your childhood with any pleasure, with any fondness? That would be a better word.
Yeah, there's very little moments. I mean, I shared a room with two of my sisters. So my little sister, who was 4 years younger than me, and also Banaz. And so there were three of us in this bedroom with, bunk beds and just the silly things like, deciding who gets to sleep on the top bunk, what night. And, those little things that we would kind of go through together, and sharing like Goosebumps books and, borrowing an item of clothing to each other. Those little things, I think,
you were a gang.
That kind of make me feel good about my childhood. But as a whole, it was really hard growing up in our household. It was hard.
How was life outside of the house? So how was school?
I think school was, for me, my biggest escape. I loved school, especially not having gone to school until I was 11. I just loved the idea that I could walk into a library and have access to all these books and go on a computer and have friends and learn all these different things, For most children, school starts when they're about, 5, 6. But for me, I was 11 going on 12 when I started going to school. And
so you've been home educated up until that point?
Not really, to be honest, because my mother was illiterate. So it was just mostly watching TV and, learning the odd alphabet here and there. So when I came to this country, I just spoke my mother tongue. I didn't know much, about learning, about school, about all those things that kids would have naturally, learned at that age already.
Yeah. And your father?
Yeah, because
in terms of his education?
So my father's quite educated. He went because he came to the UK before me and my family, a few years before us. And so he learned English, and he sent us a few books and, tapes and things to sort of learn English before we came here. So when I came to the UK, the only thing I knew was this very strange American accent of pronouncing apples and dogs, because the tapes were American. So I learned alphabets and, the few words from those tapes.
Right. And we mentioned your mum. What was your relationship like with your mother when you look back to that stage of your life?
My relationship with my mother, I think I always adored her because she was my mother. And I think every little girl can say that they absolutely adore and idolize their mother growing up. I used to think of her as, she has all these children and she manages so well in the house, and, she does a great job of raising us, and, just I guess being very resilient in her situation, especially when my father had left us alone in Iran. I always saw that she was strong. I think it's only as I got older that I kind of sometimes would think back and ask myself, why did my mother not step in at this time, especially as a woman?
Yes.
But I think in the eyes of a child, I at the time, I just admired her strength.
When Beckel left and the sort of community effectively ostracized your family, I mean, that affected you all. As I understand it, there were some significant threats. It was a visceral thing. It wasn't just whispers in the street. Mm-hmm. How did that feel for you? I mean, how were you able to, or were you able to make any kind of sense of that at all?
I think what happened was we, as children, I think we were kind of following my parents' lead in this. So for them, it was, the way I picked it up was, it was so normalized. So I remember coming home from school and seeing the fax machine and pages of faxes coming through. And there would just be threats. And, my dad would ask me to read them and translate to him what the pages said. And there would just be threats, saying, we will blow your house up with everyone in it. We will throw petrol bombs in your house.
Coming through on the fax machine.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I think because my parents normalized it, especially my father, there wasn't really any reaction. I mean, I think myself, if I received something like that now, I'd be absolutely horrified. But there wasn't any reaction. So I think for me at that time, it was just so normal. Oh, I'm just reading a piece of paper for my dad today. It's no big deal. And it didn't really, it didn't seem strange at all.
But children, you just give us an example of it. Children are incredibly resilient, but they're also sponges, aren't they? And so you and your sisters must have been absorbing that kind of constant tension.
Yeah.
However normalized it was in the way that your father would react to it, but you must have been sort of soaking all that up in the most painful way.
Yeah, and I definitely sensed the tension, because we went from socializing all of the time with our cousins, with our extended, family and community, to feeling like they don't want us anywhere near them. And this is all because my sister had left. So it was a case of dealing with the fact that, which I think we never dealt with anyway. My sister had one day been here, the next day she disappeared, and it was like she never ever was in our lives in the first place, to now dealing with the fact that everybody blames you for that and everybody is basically shutting you out because your sister has left. It was all so strange to kind of, to understand and to make sense of. And I think it gave us a lot of internalized shame and guilt, as though we were responsible. This was our fault that my sister had left.
So Beckel resists what must have been incredible pressure to keep her independence. In effect, she goes into hiding, as I understand it, and her life turns into something must have been unbelievably difficult. And your father's attention focuses on you and your other sisters, you and Banaz, of course. You're sort of effectively the route back for him, back to being a figure of respect in your community. Is that the sort of right conclusion to draw?
Yeah, definitely. I think he saw it as, well, if one of my daughters has, shamed me essentially in the community, I can then use my other daughters to sort of win back the community and win back their respect. So essentially, me and my sisters were just used either to win back respect and status, or to actually lose it.
Yeah. Do you remember anything sort of in terms of that dynamic between your family and the community? Do you remember a particular moment where you could see that both at the time when you were effectively ostracized, but then also seeing your father trying to find his way back in? Is there a memory of that?
Yeah, the things that really stick out for me is going from getting death threats to then having these wedding parties where the people that were sending us the death threats, where they're celebrating and kind of, I guess, clapping for my dad and sort of giving him the nod of you've won us back. I think that was one of the strangest things for me. It was, how did we go from you want me and my entire family dead because of my sister leaving, to now, congratulating my dad on his success marriages, two child marriages. And I think it was so strange to see. It was just so confusing.
Or to put it mildly, I mean, how you even begin to process it I think would be beyond most people listening to this podcast. But Banaz is the first to be forced into a marriage. What do you remember about that, and how did that impact you? This is your sister. You've been sharing that bedroom together. You're incredibly close, very tight unit, and then suddenly presumably she sits you down and says, "Well, Dad's just told me that I'm to be married."
She was my best friend, and we always did everything together. But all of a sudden, when the conversation of marriage for her came up, all of a sudden, I felt like my parents had kind of put a distance between us and her. So they would kind of talk to her privately. And I always found it very strange. In the beginning, I sensed that, she didn't want to tell me what was going on. And then she just said to me, my dad says I'm going to get married. And she became all, it's kind of, I guess, cheesy to describe it in this way, but she became really prim and proper, and she started behaving in the way that my parents had kind of told her to start behaving, as though she wasn't 17. It was almost like, I remember she was even wearing clothes that, for me, as teenagers, I found it so strange. She would wear like collared shirts that were more for somebody my mum's age, very mature clothing. And she started really, in the way that she behaved, really engaging differently, and, not laughing or not finding things that we would usually laugh at funny. She would just become mature overnight.
Yeah.
And I think, she felt the pressure from my parents to behave that way.
Do you think she was trying?
Sudden,
do you think she was trying to protect you as well?
I think she was very confused. Yeah, and she also didn't want me to know that, she was just going to up and leave. I think she knew that this was all going to happen. But for me, until the day she actually married and went to Birmingham, I had no idea that was happening.
Then at the age of 15, I think I'm right in saying, you're told that you're to be married. If you don't mind, Payzee, would you mind just telling us, or talking us through, the how that happened, when that happened, and then that first meeting with a man twice your age who you'd never met?
The first time that my parents did speak to me about marriage was when I was 15, yes. I was on GCSE leave, and it was really casual. My dad just said to me, there's somebody who wants to marry you. And I was quite, I guess, childish in my reaction. I sort of laughed at him and I said, but I'm just 15. And I think he took great offense to that, because thereafter he sort of really distanced himself, and he really emotionally abandoned me. And not long after that, it was only a few months, I think maybe 6 months or something after that, I turned 16 now. And then he said to me again, that there's somebody who wants to marry you, there's a new person. And I think all I could think about was how much it hurt, and how, lonely, and how terrible it felt to have my father's reaction from the first time. That this time round, I just felt like I had no choice. I felt like, if I say no again, what could my dad do after the last time? Let me just say yes and please him. So it went from that conversation, again, very informal, to just being called into our living room. And I was told not to speak. I was told to just sit there and, pay my respects. And I remember having a very quick, sneak at this guy. And I was just terrified. Who is this guy? He's a complete stranger. I don't know him. And I know for a fact this is my fate. This is me, and my future is this. There was a very strange dynamic between me and my father in the sense that I always, yearned from the bottom of my heart for his approval and to make him proud. And there were sort of very small drops of his proud moments when he would, let's say, ask me to translate something for him, or he would ask me to do something. And he would raise me and make me feel like he was proud of me for a second. But that particular time when he just allowed this stranger to basically come into my life and, take away the best years of my life, it just made me, I think, deep down, start really resenting him and just feeling just so hurt by him.
And that's not a gradual thing. You walk into your sitting room, there's a man you'd never met, twice your age, as I say. Your father's in front of you, the man you trust as your father, and you're going to marry that man. It's not a gradual slide towards that, is it? It's a sudden thing. I mean, it must have been an unbelievably, apart from anything, it must have been a terrifying moment for you.
Yeah, it was it really was such a shock because I was in a whole new world. I was thinking to myself, I'm going to go to college and I'm going to wear the clothes that I like. I don't have to wear uniform anymore. I couldn't wait. And I was told that when I go to college, I'll have a mobile phone. And
Mm,
at the time, the thought of a Nokia was mind blowing. You know, you'll have a Nokia phone all
mm,
to yourself. This was my priorities, and this is what was so exciting for me. But it was just almost like a big, smack in my face that
mm.
was such a reality check. And, it was just so confusing. I think I use that word a lot because I was often asking myself, am I wrong for not wanting this?
Mm,
Would every other girl in my position be, just doing what their parents say? Because that's all I knew.
mm.
But at the same time, deep down, I knew this is wrong. This isn't right. This isn't what anybody should be doing. Anybody my age. None of my friends are doing this. And, all of my friends have their own lives and don't feel this way about their dads.
So the marriage takes place.
Hmm.
What do you remember of the wedding day itself?
The wedding day, I was unsure in terms of where I was going because I'd never seen where I was going next. I was just told to pack my things.
Right.
So,
Well,
I,
you didn't know that it was the wedding day.
no, I didn't.
Right.
I got all glammed up, I had all this makeup put on me and the wedding dress, but I didn't really understand that this is what makes it official. Because
Mm.
prior to that, I'd had my Islamic ceremony, and again, I was all dolled up, and basically, this imam went through the process of marrying me to this man, but then I still stayed at my parents' house. So it was all like, so what's next? And nobody was telling me this is what's going to happen. You'll have the wedding and then you go to your husband's house. But they just said to me, pack your stuff. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't want to leave any of my books behind. I want to take all my posters and, my silly little diaries, my fluffy pens and things like that.
Yeah.
That was really what was so important to me. And so the wedding party happened, and I think that was one of those moments where I think reality started kicking in, where I thought, okay, everyone is here and there's a massive celebration. So maybe I'm not going back home. And it was only when the wedding ended that I then went to this hotel with my husband, um, which was supposed to be our honeymoon. And again, I had no idea what any of this meant. You have to bear in mind, growing up in my household, I didn't know what marriage was. I didn't know what relationships were. I had never had access to a sex education. All of those topics were completely restricted from our lives. And so the idea of marriage, I didn't even know what that meant. I'd only ever seen my parents who were married and all my aunts and, Banaz who was married. And from seeing Banaz's marriage, it just looked so depressing and so nothing that I wanted any part in.
I've heard you describe yourself at that moment as a sort of like feeling like a kind of auction item, that you were something that was for sale. You've been completely sort of dehumanized.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I remember being told by my parents, when you meet your husband, don't speak. It was almost like, we've presented this picture of you, just keep the picture as we've presented it and don't embarrass us.
Yeah.
It was so strange.
We mentioned it earlier, but your marriage was then, you then had a registry office service. It was a registered marriage. And of course, that's not something that can happen within the community only. That involves people from outside of the community, a whole range of different individuals. So that dress that you described had to be bought from a shop. The arrangements for the party, all these things involved other people outside of your community. No one raised a question. No one said, what's happening here? No, nobody asked you, are you okay?
No, not a single person. And I just remember going through all of those moments of, the wedding being organized and going shopping. And I just kept throwing tantrums. And yet again, as you said, not a single person ever thought something was off. I remember being in a jeweler's in South London in Tooting, and we were going around from shop to shop because my parents kept telling me to choose jewelry and to choose, big, huge necklaces and things like that. And the thought of those things just, made me sick, because all I kept thinking was, well, my favorite pop stars don't wear those things, so I don't like those things. And, I want something glittery like my favorite pop stars.
Mm.
And we would be in these shops and, I'd kick up a fuss every time. And I would just say, I don't want to. My mum would say, try this on or try that on. And the shopkeepers would just be there really trying to sell us, trying to make money. And they didn't care that this young girl, this, teenager was being basically forced by her parents to buy wedding jewelry, marriage bands, those kind of things. They just didn't even care.
What about the registrar on the day of that service?
To be honest, even then, nothing. And I think I was in quite a particular mood that day, because I really felt like this isn't just within, as you said, our community. This isn't just the imam. I know this is going to get stopped here. I know someone's going to say, "Hold on a second."
Yeah, that's how you felt on that day. This is the moment when when people will realise.
Yeah, I really did, because I'd never seen a child get married, and I thought my parents, I didn't even know it was legal to be married at that age, and I thought that that's when they would say, hold on, how old is this girl? And maybe they'll speak to me on my own. And if they spoke to me on my own, I'll tell them, I don't want to be married, so please just stop it if you can.
But no one asked you?
No, it was over in 5 minutes. They made us sign pieces of papers, and they said, do you want to take pictures in the garden? And I just thought, oh my God.
How do you rationalise that now, Payzee? How do you not have, or maybe you do, have anger towards those people now? I mean, how do you try and rationalise it in your mind? What was it? Ignorance, laziness, cruelty? Where on that spectrum do you sort of place, those people who, let's put it mildly, turned a blind eye?
To be honest with you, I feel very angry at those people. I do feel there was definitely ignorance involved. I think sometimes people judge from the outside and think to themselves, well, they might be from a certain community, so why should I get involved? And I think there was definitely a big factor of that in my situation, because I truly believe that had, let's say, an English girl ended up in a registry office with a man twice her age, I do believe somebody would be asking the question, what is going on here? Is especially, remembering my mood very clearly and being very, miserable and sulking. I know somebody would have picked something up.
So even now, along a lot further down the road beyond your marriage, presumably you would still say to anybody who find themselves in the orbit of a situation like that, say something, do something, step in, ask the question.
Yeah, definitely. I think so many people are so worried that they'll offend somebody, but I always think to myself, would you rather be accused of offending somebody, or actually not doing anything and turning a blind eye and not knowing what that person has to live with? Because even though you mentioned, some of the people up until this point of the story that could have changed something, it blows my mind that not one person I came across in my life ever even said to me, what is going on? Is this, are you okay? Because none of it seemed normal. Yeah. Everything about it looked off.
You're married. You touched on the fact that you're then taken to this hotel. Your husband has expectations, let's put it that way, and you refuse, and he attacks you immediately, I think. and you turn to your parents and tell them what happened, and you are, as I understand it, offered no support whatsoever and effectively told to get on with it. This is your life now.
Yeah, I was shamed for speaking up because, as I said, I had no idea what was expected of me what my husband expected. I didn't know this is what happens. I didn't know that, honestly, it might sound very naive, but the truth is, up until the day I actually was faced with, the situation, I had no idea that this is what happens between a man and a woman. I had no knowledge of that. And this is a British girl living in London. Because I had that much control over what I did, who I spoke to, what I looked at, what I watched, I had no idea. And so I was quite, I think the only thing I can describe is I was so terrified of what does it mean for somebody to be that physically close to me? Because I didn't know what it meant. I thought it only amounted to violence. I didn't know this is what happens. And I knew, absolutely nothing will change how I feel about this person. Even at such a young age, I knew there was nothing that could make me feel any different to the amount of, resentment and hate and bitterness I felt towards this man already, because I fell pregnant very early on in my marriage.
Yes. You had an abortion. Mm-hmm. How were you able, if you don't mind me asking, Payzee, because this is a deeply personal question, and if you'd like to move on, we'll move on. But I think it's a demonstration of your unbelievable resilience. Having heard everything that you've explained so far, I have no doubt that anyone listening to this would agree. Where did you find the courage to do that? And where did you find the support to do that?
I remember when my family came to the UK in 1999, and I think a dream I had from the day we came to this country was that one day I will be able to be the woman that I want to be, and I will be able to make the choices I want to make. And no matter what happened in my life, even up until this point where I was faced with, deciding on an abortion and having no idea what that looked like, I just kept reminding myself in the back of my mind that there's one day I'm going to have my chance. One day I'm going to live my life, even if it means I will be married to my husband for 50 years. For the last 2 years of my life, I will be my own person. And I think that's something that kept me going. And I don't know where that dream came from, because even from being a very little girl in Iran, I would picture what the Western world would look like. And I would picture living in a world where women had rights and women were free. And, women could travel on their own. I know for some people listening, this might sound really crazy, but the idea that a woman could make her own choices, from where I'm from, and a woman could travel alone and live alone and do the things she wanted to, they were very, very far from reality. And so this thought just kept me going. I think that's one of the things that just always stayed alive in me. I just always had this fantasy that I'm going to be free one day.
Let's just talk about the period that for a while, as I understand it, both you and Banaz were living together with your husband.
Yes, yeah.
How would you describe your state of mind at that stage?
I think I was in fantasy mode, because the reality of mine and Banaz's life was that we were miserable because we were living with our husbands, but we were also so happy because we were living together. And we just found happiness in the silliest things, cleaning the house, which we naturally hated doing for these men that we just disliked, cleaning the house together whilst the men went to work, it was a joy, and we would blast music. We couldn't do those things when they were at home. So we would blast modern music, obviously, like, artists that we love, Mariah Carey and, Boyzone and Westlife. And we would blast this music and dance our way through cleaning and just laugh. And, we would find those moments that kept us going. And then when our husbands would come home, reality would set in, and we almost switch back to being, wives.
Banaz, as I mentioned in the intro, was physically abused by her husband. She left him and went home, back to your parents. Later, she began a relationship with Ramat Soleimani, a relationship that your father refused to acknowledge. In fact, I think I'm right in saying that he banned her from seeing him. But that relationship continued, and then there were more of those death threats that you mentioned before. The community considered this to be a sort of dishonor to the collective, if you can put it that way. Those death threats were reported to the police, as I understand it, both Ramat, death threats against both Ramat and your sister. And then in the January, Banaz is reported missing by Ramat. Do you what are you able to kind of, because you must have, I'm sure, trace back every step of this in your mind, that period between sort of the threats and Banaz's disappearance? What are you, when you think back to that period, how do you remember it? How do you feel about it?
It felt like, here we go again, because what had happened with my other sister was now happening all over again. And I think once again, it became normalized. The fact that somebody was receiving death threats, the fact that somebody was being followed. And this was my sister. She would tell me about it, and she would say, today I went to the police station and I told them about this phone call that I received. And I think because of what our family had already experienced, it was just this normal thing to be receiving death threats over dating somebody that other people didn't approve of. It just became incredibly normal that if you do something others don't like, you can receive death threats. But I think the difference, which I didn't see at the time, I never pictured in a million years in my wildest dreams that anything would ever happen to my sister. Because I'd seen all of this happen before. I'd seen the death threats. Even my father had reported the death threats he was receiving to the police. And all these years later on, for my sister to be receiving these death threats again, being followed, being harassed, I just thought nothing will come of this. She'll get harassed for a few years until my father will do something to overcome another, this other obstacle. And then it will just maybe kick off again in another few years. That's really how it felt at the time. But I never imagined, even to the day that my sister was reported to the police, I never ever imagined that anything would happen.
So it's 2006, I think I'm right in saying, January 2006, yes, when Banaz is reported missing by Ramat. When you heard that she was missing, what was your first thought? Did you fear the worst?
No, absolutely not. When I heard she was missing, I thought to myself, she's probably, just turned off her phone and she's just, hiding for a day or two. I never, ever thought anything could have happened to her. Like, it didn't even cross my mind. Her boyfriend was really concerned, but I just thought maybe she's thinking, I'm just going to hide for a bit until all of this calms down. But I never thought, nothing ever crossed my mind of her being in danger. Never.
At what point do you start worrying?
To be honest with you, my sister was missing. So at the end of January, she went missing. All of February, all of March, And for the most of April, she was still missing. I can't say in any of those months leading up to the police saying, we found your sister, it ever crossed my mind that she's not safe or she's not alive. It never crossed my mind. I had all these crazy thoughts about what country she'd gone to, what she's doing, where she's renting a bedroom. I had all these crazy thoughts. But the idea that she could be hurt or she could be dead, it never crossed my mind. Never. And even when the police, said that they'd found my sister, I didn't believe it. There was obviously such a huge level of shock and, surreal moment. But I couldn't process the fact that this could be real. This could have happened to her.
As you mentioned, Payzee, Banaz is found. Her body is found in the garden of a house in Birmingham. Mm-hmm. That moment when you're told that that's what's happened. I mean, who tells you that? Do you talk to your parents? Is it a conversation with your parents, or is that a conversation that you're having with the police?
So the police actually got our family together, and that's when they told us the news. I think it was towards the end of April, and we were very adamant. This can't be real. How is this possible? And the police said that they had actually checked against her dental records, and they confirmed that this was my sister.
And the community at that stage. We'll talk about obviously the difficulties with your family from that point on, but the community puts up a wall of obstruction, as I understand it, really, and no cooperation, no support, no help. I mean, that alone for you to have witnessed must have been deeply traumatic. On top of the fact that your sister has been killed. This idea that it's going to be covered up, was that clear to you at that stage?
Yeah, it was, because nobody was. When you think of a community, you think people who support you. But even at that time, the experience I'd had from our community was that they will do anything but support you. And so, although I didn't expect much from them at that point, it was still so painful to see that even at a time like this, your community will still not support you. And they will do everything in their power to actually, as you said, hide what's happened and hide the truth. Even though my sister was at this point already not alive anymore.
It's some time, of course, before those responsible are brought to trial. Those responsible include your father and your uncle and other relatives. Payzee, how do you begin to cope? How do you begin to find sense with a situation that is so dark on so many levels at that point in your life?
Oh God, I'm going to try to answer that question. To be honest with you, it's something I'm still trying to make sense of. You try to, make sense of the fact that you grew up in this, in this particular dynamic, and then, one of your sisters just disappeared one day, and then another sister disappeared one day, and then your father goes to prison, and then your uncle goes to prison. And it feels like, from very early on in my life, so many, just one thing after the other. And I think I'm still trying to make sense of it and still trying to, I guess one thing I did for a long time is to try to understand why. But it's that's really a way to I realized to torment myself and to just torture myself, because I'll never know why. I'll never really understand why any of this happened, because it doesn't make sense.
Of course. You're a believer in counselling and its positive influence. How soon were you able to start getting that? Because your life, Payzee, I hope you don't mind me saying so, up until this point in the story, I'm not really seeing where you're getting support from anyone other than your sisters, one of whom has now been killed. I don't know where you're getting support from, so I don't know how you're surviving at this stage. But at some point you start getting support. When's the first moment when you start to feel the world is now beginning to understand what's going on here? Is it when the sort of reality of the crime and the arrests and the process that starts thereafter? Did the support for you start in sort of parallel with that, or did it come later?
I'm afraid it didn't start there. I always felt, and I think this was something that I don't believe the police managed very well, because although they were dealing with perpetrators who were the victim's family, I think there was a great deal of the police against the family. And so I personally always felt like there was not much support, even though we were going through this as a family. And yes, the police were prosecuting a family member, but they were not prosecuting every family member, and that there were people who were affected by this and who were, sad to see this happening. It might shock you, but I think the first time I felt a sense of support was maybe a few years ago. In terms of counselling, it started quite early on. I think I was maybe a year after my sister's death. My college tutor had suggested that I speak to somebody. And I felt, instead of, this helping me and this making me kind of start my journey onto, I guess, accepting and healing, it was actually very traumatic. For at least 7-8 years of counselling, it was extremely traumatic, because every time I went to a counsellor, I felt very misunderstood, and I felt as though the things I was talking about, they were not understood, and they were not picked up. I think they didn't understand the level of, so all the different, because for me, whenever I look at my life and my situation, there are so many complexities, and there's so many different layers of, control and manipulation and coercion and abuse, and there's so many different factors. And I would often, I had this quite a few times, I would often speak to therapists about, for example, my relationship with my father, and I would, really try to understand where to go from here and how to move on and how to heal from everything that has happened between me and my father. And I would often get suggestions like, but you should go and see your father and speak to him. And I used to feel like, but my father is in prison for my sister's murder. This isn't advice that I can take. This isn't useful advice. And they would always say to me, well, the only way to rebuild your relationship and to move on is to start having open communication. And I just used to feel like I'm talking to people who don't understand what I'm talking about, and they don't understand this level of control. And this, I think there was also quite a lack of, I don't want to say cultural, because it's not so much cultural sensitivity. It's more, I think they just didn't understand the dynamics of, let's say, growing up in an environment like that. And I tried various counselors. I think the point where I just gave up was maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. I had a therapist, and I spoke to her about one of the difficult things for me to overcome was accepting my sister's death and living with my grief. And we sort of spoke really in depth about, the way my sister had lost her life. And while I was talking, she actually broke down and she started crying. And I just felt so bad, because I thought, if somebody like her is not able to cope with the things that I've gone through, surely this is not repairable. Surely I can't move on from this, and I just have to live with it, and I just have to stop trying to get help.
Goodness. We've talked a bit in previous podcasts, Payzee, with other guests about the value of counselling and how it is so important that you find the right person. That's as important as taking the step to go and getting help in the first place. You've just given us the most visceral, the most extreme sort of demonstration of why that's right. I hope I'm right in saying that you've continued with that aspect of your recovery, if I can use that word, and that you have found the right people and that you have made progress.
I finally have. I do. I've only actually started this year, and I am actually getting therapy from a Kurdish therapist. So she's very, knowledgeable on these issues, and it's as you said, it takes time. And 14 years later, I found the right person. Thank God. I think the older I get, and the more that I start thinking about, what it really means to support your children or to have a support system in your family, the more I sort of feel quite let down and quite neglected by my parents. So I think it's living with all of that and still trying to maintain the relationships. It's challenging, to say the least.
I don't know, Payzee, some of the sentences that come out of your of your mouth as we're having this conversation, that I feel slightly let down by my parents. I think anyone listening to this will just I hope be loaded with nothing but sympathy, but also I hope admiration, because you've done all this yourself. That's, I think, one of the most remarkable aspects of your story, if you don't mind me saying so, is that there's been no help really until this year that you're finally having a conversation that's helping you. I mean, it's just remarkable. You have used what is an unbelievably profound and deeply moving phrase, Payzee, that I did touch on earlier, that for you, your sister's death enabled your freedom. Is that why you're now putting this campaign, to work in the way that you are, in such a kind of powerful way? Is that I'm assuming is what is for you the kind of driving force behind it?
It definitely is a big part of why I do what I do and why I've kind of dedicated my life to this. I think one of the things that is really hard to live with is the fact that, as tragic as it sounds, my sister's death is what pushed me to get out of my marriage. And although I feel, often I feel incredibly guilty that she's not able to continue her life and I am, it's something that, stays with me often. And at the same time, it gives me a massive drive and a push to say this can't keep happening. What happened to my sister and what happened when I was a child, it can't happen to other girls. And it might sound really crazy, but I ask myself, this is really difficult, and why have I taken this journey? And it's never long before, a matter of minutes before I remember that I have to, if not just for me, for my sister, and she deserved better. So although I can't save her and I can't change what happened to her, it can change somebody else's life.
You, as part of this journey that you're on now, you gave a TED talk, which I listened to. And to anyone listening to this podcast, I would strongly urge you to give up about 15 minutes of your life and listen to it, because it's an astonishing thing. How how difficult was that to do, Payzee? Because you did it brilliantly, and that's the first time really that you've kind of stood on a stage and told that story in the way that you told it. It must have been an incredibly difficult challenge for you, but you really met it.
You know, I think it was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. With everything that I've experienced in my life and the way that I was raised, there's so much shame and a feeling of, you know, not wanting to be loud and to be the center of attention. There's a lot of that is internalized, and I'm continuously working to get rid of that, especially, you know, all my life hearing as a gal, don't draw attention to yourself, you know, don't be loud, don't speak loud, don't behave in a loud manner. Doing something like that was so challenging because I had to sort of really, you know, challenge all those things that I've been taught all my life. And up until the moment that actually on the morning of the day I was doing the talk, I just kept saying to myself, I won't be able to do this. And the night before my talk, I actually dreamt of my sister. And I think it's very rare that I dream of her. It's, you know, in the last 14 years, maybe I've dreamt of her 5 times. It's very, very rare. And I actually dreamt of her that night. And when I woke up, I felt as though she was almost giving me her blessing. I'm not very spiritual, or, you know, I'm not one of those people that believes in signs and things like that, but it was so rare to dream of her. And I know that's what gave me the power and the courage to just go on stage that day. I had cards. I was supposed to read my whole thing. I was struggling to remember it all. I noticed that you were completely without notes.
I know some people use an autocue occasionally on TED, but you did an amazing job.
Thank you. I know my sister gave me the courage and the strength to do that. I swear I could not have done it by myself.
Well, you did it brilliantly. Of course, what we should say is that, you know, in almost in parallel to a lot of the story that we've been talking about, you have worked, right? You're a very talented fashion stylist. You've had a number of jobs. I know it's not been the straightest of roads professionally, but you've been a terrific success. It's a very important part of your life, isn't it? When you think of that part of your life, you know, when we talked earlier about all that oppression that you had in your upbringing, it's not just that you survived, but that you also had the courage to pursue that career. It's an extraordinary thing. That's a big part of your life still, yes, and will be always.
Yes, yeah. I think fashion was always a bit of an outlet for me. I think one of the first things I noticed as a little girl was how people dressed at parties and how people dressed when they were happy and getting together. And I think not being able to do those things, especially when we came to the UK and all my friends were dressing up and stuff, it just made me want to do it more. And it just made me kind of visualize for the day that I could do it. And I would watch my mum on her sewing machine. She would often make us things, and she was extremely creative. And I know I get my creativity from her because she would just take a piece of fabric and she would turn it into something before your eyes, you know, incredibly talented. And she'd never studied this. She just saw her mother doing it. And I would go on her sewing machine. She had a very old Singer machine. I would go on her machine and make things, and she would say, "Where did you get that from?" And I would say, "I made it." And she wouldn't believe me. And she would say to me, "I don't believe it. Show me how you did it." And I would show her, and she would be absolutely shocked. And it was just from watching her that I would learn. And I kind of, you know, just continued with that. And it just gave me, I think because I wasn't allowed to express myself for so long. It was
your freedom, right?
Yeah, exactly. It just made me feel like I want to communicate this to the world. And, you know, I think at a time in the 90s, fashion was just so incredible in the UK. And I remember, you know, seeing music videos and posters and things like that and just thinking, wow, you can express yourself with clothes. That must be so incredible.
Payzee, we ask all our guests on this podcast to give us 3 crisis cures. If I'm honest, as I say that, it feels like a trivial request, given the story that you've told us. And the last thing I want to do is trivialize your story. But what we do is that we ask people to give us 3 things that they kind of lean on in the darkest days. Not another person or a process. We've discussed that. But are there 3 specific things that when I ask that question that come to your mind?
I think thank God I can say this now, because throughout the last 14 years there was a lot of things that I should have never turned to as a coping mechanism that I did for very long. But I think I've started to pick up really healthy habits of coping. And one thing for me that I always turn to is creativity. So, I just think to myself, if I'm not in the best place, I want to make something and I want to, be creative. So that's definitely something I turn to.
What did you make the last time you did that?
What did I make? Oh, I actually made a 2-piece, a trouser and a top. Yes. Right. Wow. Very soft, kind of warm cotton fabric, cozy, just something to chill around in the house with.
Yeah. Good. Right. Well, that's the first, and 2 more.
I think one thing that also really helps me is building up my own kind of network of support. So, social media for me is really where I found a great deal of support and almost friendships. I never knew speaking out and telling my story would encourage so many young, especially Kurdish girls and women to sort of support me and to tell me their stories. So for me, I find that reminding myself that I have the support is incredibly, it helps me remember why I'm doing this and what I'm doing it for.
Very good. And the third thing?
The third thing, I think walking. Yeah. I absolutely love walking. As a child, I had to walk to most places because my parents were always talking about how cars were bad for the environment, and we shouldn't take the car unless the journey was over an hour. So I kind of got used to walking, but now I just find it so soothing and calming and relaxing, especially having my dog. So I just take him on his leash and go for a walk, and that always really helps me.
There aren't words really that I can say to summarize the conversation that we've had today, other than thank you. Usually we end the podcast asking listeners to leave a review or a rating for us, but I'm not going to do that today. Instead, I'm going to ask those of you listening to sign Payzee's petition, which you'll find at change.org. The link will also be on the episode summary and on our website, www.crisiswhatcrisis.com. So please do it. Payzee, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. You're an amazing woman.
Thank you so much, Andy. Thanks for having me.